Hereby, I open this academic ceremony of Maastricht University. The ceremony takes place online, and I welcome the candidate, E.C.Sina. I welcome the supervisors. I welcome the members of the Defense Committee, and I welcome everyone watching this ceremony online. In this ceremony, E.C.Sina will defend the academic thesis entitled Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora and its implementation in the United States of America, the European Union, Tanzania, India, and Colombia, a study on the implementation of obligations under a multilateral environmental agreement. Dear candidate, may I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. Okay, good afternoon to everyone who is joining us today.
Frank, you have to start the presentation. It's not started yet. In the bottom. No?
Here. Is it visible now?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Once again, thank you for joining me for my defense. I'm really humbled. I know people from Tanzania are watching, and everyone who is joining us, thank you once again. My presentation is divided into three parts. I will present the preliminaries. I will then present the summary of my conclusions, and then I'll present the future research areas based on the findings of my study. By way of introduction, multilateral environmental agreements are formulated to solve or mitigate existing global environmental problems. One of such instruments is CITES, which was formulated in the year 1973 as a global agreement among governments, which aims at ensuring that trade in international trade in the species of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. The convention has now 184 parties and covers well over 38,700 species. And these parties are found throughout the globe, and the species are also scattered throughout the world. Despite existence of the convention and the national initiatives, including ones that aims at enforcing the convention, illegal international trade of endangered species continue and is one of the major environmental concerns of present times. Legal trade is a multi-billion industry. Illegal trade itself is estimated to be around 23 billion annually. I know there are issues regarding the credibility of this data, but this is based on the existing information from existing studies. Existence of the trade, which is increasing in terms of the species traded and the increase in the value of the trade itself, suggests a shortcoming in the existing framework, and therefore a need to evaluate the existing framework, and therefore a motivation for this study. The main objective of my research was to examine the existing CITES implementation framework and practices generally, and in selected jurisdiction, and thereafter recommend how to improve the same. I was guided by four key questions, which sought to examine the implementation of CITES generally and in selected jurisdictions, explored the legal and administrative systems set for implementation of the convention, and issues impacting the implementation of the convention positively and the ones which negatively impairs the implementation. I explored the lessons that could be learned from the implementation practices in the selected jurisdictions and recommended how to enhance the implementation of CITES in the selected jurisdiction and other countries. In the next part, I'm going to present the summary of my conclusions. I'll start with general framework governing implementation of CITES. I would say, firstly, CITES represent compromise among contracting parties, and it requires all trade of CITES listed species to comply with permitting and assessing system. The convention is not self-executing. It requires parties to take positive domestic actions to enforce the same, and therefore its effectiveness relies on the willingness of the parties. There are 4 or 5 obligations that parties are required to comply to. This includes designation of management and scientific authorities, establish and enforce permitting or licensing system, which requires existence of legal accusation certifications, and finding for non-detrimental environmental impact to the species traded. Parties are also required to enact and enforce laws that deter and confiscate illegally traded species. Parties are required to produce and communicate reports on the implementation of CITES, which include annual and biannual reports. Parties must respond to communication by CITES. The other obligation include funding to the CITES operations and compliance with the quota system. The convention has and can contribute towards attainment of many positive conservation outcomes. Its existence has political and legal significance. It is still a work in progress. While it has attained some degree of legal effectiveness in terms of parties, a number of parties contracting, compliance with key obligations, effectiveness of the institutions, but the convention has still issues to do with the ecology, and it's normative, it's not yet as effective in terms of normativeness. Generally, the convention has potential to make positive behavioral change among parties, and it has increased conservation efforts among contracting parties. In terms of implementation in the case study jurisdictions and factors affecting, I've noted that the implementation of the convention is varied. Parties have different legal framework and administrative system, which all seek to enforce the convention, and have been placed in different categories by the National Legislative Program of CITES. You have US, EU, and Colombia, which are in Tier 1, that they meet all the required legislative criteria, whereas Tanzania and India are in Tier 2. In terms of factors that promote effective implementation of the convention, I have noted the use of robust scientific approaches, allocation of financial and adequate financial and human resources, existence of strong and independent institutions, as well as effective domestic and international collaboration as factors that may or have been deployed to further the implementation of the convention. This is in particular in the US, EU, and in some extent in other jurisdictions. In terms of factors that impair in the implementation of the convention, we have lack of institutional capacity, issues to do with limitation of financial resources and the human capital. There are also issues within the institution themselves, the way they are set up, the administrative structures, but there are issues to do with the legal framework. Some laws are very complex to appreciate. The EU wildlife regulations, for example, and the Indian laws. Some laws are scattered. They are not found in one piece that you could find in Colombia, and there are a wide array of sanctioning, and in some jurisdictions, the sentencing for wrongdoing in the contravention of the laws enforcing the convention is very lenient. Developing countries, for example, Tanzania and Colombia, do not prioritize conservation matters as much as other pressing issues. But generally, in many countries, there is limited awareness, and the economy of the poor economies of local people tend to affect implementation among case study countries. The other conclusion is in terms of lesson learned. As I said, implementation vary. What matters is commitment of the parties to enforce and compliance with the key CITES obligations. Effective enforcement of CITES enforcing law require more than legal action. Deployment of scientific approaches, collaboration, and commitment are key. I've noted domestic and international cooperation is critical for effective implementation of the convention. Bestowment of resources and specialization of law enforcing authorities. Here I refer to investigation, prosecution, and adjudication bodies. Strategic stakeholder engagement is key and required for effective implementation, and that is seen in terms of how the business community is involved, policymakers are involved in development of a legal framework and in enforcement. So how to enhance the implementation? Generally, I call for the evaluation of the approaches of the convention itself to make it a more facilitating instrument rather than a trade restricting instrument as it appears now. I call for improvement of the CITES listing process to make it more transparent and consultative, and regulation of legal marketplaces.
Oh, is it Ren? Sorry.
Can I continue? Okay.
Yes.
The other recommendation includes introduction of independent peer reviews on implementation of CITES so as to appreciate and take care of the risk of self-reporting and misreporting. In terms of specific measures among case study countries, and in particular, I know these are varied, but generally there is a need to improve law enforcement actions, which would require mindful engagement of stakeholders, specialization, and accountability of people involved. Community-based wildlife management approaches are also recommended, as well as sustainable use or incentive-driven conservation approaches. Allocation of adequate financial and human resources is also recommended in Chapter 8, as well as empowering of responsible enforcement authorities to reduce the bureaucratic process. And lastly, again, international collaboration and as well as domestic collaboration is recommended. In terms of what can be done in this field of research, I have noted there's an opportunity to further investigate on how effective community-based natural resource conservation management approaches can be implemented, how to conduct peer reviews within the CITES framework, and how best can sustainable use approaches be implemented. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Peters. Professor Peters is Professor of Environmental Policy and Law at our university, and she is also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I would like to open this round of questions with congratulating you with having completed your PhD study on such an important topic, the legal protection of wildlife, of flora, fauna, where you concentrate on the legal protection provided by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Your thesis succeeds in its objective, which is to provide a comparative analysis of the implementation and challenges of this convention in 5 selected jurisdictions. It concludes with a reflection and discussion of how to strengthen implementation. In this sense, your thesis is a typical example of important environmental law research that time and again calls for better implementation and enforcement of established norms. There are plenty of environmental conventions, but the devil is in the implementation of these norms. And that also applies to this treaty that you discuss, even while it already exists for 50 years. We have this year its 50th anniversary. Your thesis brings together many resources on the setup and functioning of CITES and the implementation, and that is, as such, quite an effort. It is often indeed not easy to understand what the level of implementation in different jurisdictions is. In relation to this, I have a question for you, and this question emerged when reading your first research question, question A on page 13, which is actually about the how question, how a site is implemented. My question to you is, what is the precise analysis that you have made in addition to already published reports, including the implementation assessments already produced within the CITES framework? In relation to this, I would like to invite you to explain what you actually understand with the word implementation and what the methodological challenges are to identify whether there is good implementation, particularly when we take the word implementation in a broad sense. When reading the propositions added to your thesis, I found it very interesting to see in proposition 9, the longest proposition, that you explain the contribution your thesis has made to existing literature. Nonetheless, I invite you to take now the opportunity to explain at the hand of a clear and concrete example of how your thesis adds to the already existing insights on the state of affairs of implementation. So I don't mean a discussion about solutions forward that you also covered in your presentation, but what you did not cover in your interesting PowerPoint presentation is what is exactly understood with implementation. Is, for instance, case law from the courts systematically included in it? Is criminal law included? Is procedural law included? And what are the methodological challenges or limits to understand how exactly implementation took place? I very much look forward to your answer.
Thank you very much, dear esteemed opponent. I'm really honored to have you. My understanding of your comment is to the effect that there are various conventions, but the issue is to do with their implementation. And you are of the opinion that defining implementation varies, and there are various approaches which could be done. And the other question is in regard to what actual contribution do I make in the course of this thesis. To start with my understanding of implementation, I would say multilateral environmental agreements are aimed at adding to existing national approaches towards resolving international global environmental problems. And therefore, they basically represent the commitment of the parties to enforce actions for a better good. And therefore, while international conventions provide key issues that each parties must take positive action towards, the actual implementation action required to be taken by the parties, depending on the natural environment to which the parties are found. So the convention may set up key or indicative criteria to which the convention must be implemented, but the parties themselves must take positive action. This would include, and mostly include, in enactment of the laws, but actual enforcement of the law is key here. In the absence of actual enforcement of the law, we couldn't say the parties are implementing the convention. And therefore, I think key to implementation of the convention is, apart from enacting the legal instrument, is taking positive action to enforce the laws themselves, ensure that the domestic persons are compliant with the requirement of the law, which enforces international obligations. That is to do with my understanding of the implementation. In regarding to the methodology that I deployed to analyze how parties implement, as indicated in chapter 1, I basically deployed descriptive analysis approaches where I explored the existing literature, studies, and reports by authorities responsible for enforcement of the law, but also used normative approach where I studied the law itself, compared to the implementation with other countries, and then thereafter I developed my understanding of the topic and my conclusions. The last part wanted me to point out actual contribution I made to the existing discussions, which are now, I would say, a lot on the subject, because I think it's one of the interesting area of present times. So I think during my study, I have noted there are less discussion which takes a comparative look on how parties implement conventions on the field. Most of the discussions are based on the framework itself, the convention, and the structures of the convention, the committees, the secretariat, key issues at high level, international level, without going to the actual ground approaches or issues. So I try to bring that up together, discuss the international convention generally, but also see how the actual implementation is done among the parties. And as you can see, the parties come from different economic positions. You have developed countries, the US, the EU, but you have also developing jurisdiction, for example, India, but you have also Tanzania, which is still struggling economically. So the implementation can vary. While the convention set out uniform standards, so I tried to explore how best we can have a harmonized understanding of the implementation practices. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Verschuren. Professor Verschuren is Professor of International and European Environmental Law at Tilburg University, and he's also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would like to welcome him very much to Maastricht University today. You have the floor.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, although I would rather have been in Maastricht rather than sitting at my desk. Thank you. I would like to start with complimenting you on a job well done, dear candidate. You researched the implementation of CITES at the domestic level in a range of quite different countries. And I was very happy to see that you don't only look in the law of the books, but also in law in practice, what is really happening on the ground. I think that's really necessary for a topic like this. The setup of your empirical research is a bit loose and eclectic from a methodological point of view, but this does not impact on the content of your findings. I think your findings are very authoritative and important. And I must say, after having read your thesis, I also was a little bit depressed and disappointed because your conclusions are quite similar to those of an earlier PhD project that I supervised by Karin Baakman in 2011, so that's more than 10 years ago, on the implementation of CITES and 4 other international nature conservation treaties. And you referred to her work a lot in your thesis. And it seems that not much has changed. Perhaps only that things have only become worse. So that's really, maybe it's just my age, but I get really depressed when I see these kind of things. And I think, will we ever have effective international nature conservation law in place that really achieves its goals? Well, if we look at your conclusions, and this was also obvious from your presentation just now, the main issue seems to be the lack of capacity everywhere. So not sufficient well-trained and well-equipped people who can do inspections and be involved in enforcement. And this largely seems to be a domestic problem because it's a national political decision how much budget and how many people are allocated to the enforcement of CITES. And I was wondering whether CITES or international community around CITES has a role to play, and what role. In your conclusions and also in your presentation now, you mentioned enhanced international cooperation and write such things as cross-border and regional cooperation should be strengthened. But how, if we have structurally underpaid and understaffed secretariat and understaffed and underpaid enforcement agencies in these countries? So my question is, what can be done at the international level to enhance the domestic capacity to monitor and enforce CITES?
Thank you very much, dear esteemed opponent. My understanding of your concern or question is how best can we improve the international cooperation to make it more effective and reach the desired outcomes. Generally, as discussed in chapter 3, chapter 2 of my thesis, enforcement of international convention relies on the willingness of the political parties, of the parties which are contracting, as you said, which are influenced by politicians and who sometimes do not appreciate the significance of environmental issues and enforcement of the laws. I also take note of the fact that international cooperation is itself dependent on what actually takes place among the parties. So if parties have institutions which lack funds and which are not capacitated, even if it exists, it's not likely to bring the desired outcome. Nevertheless, I still see potential for international cooperation, which is likely to impact on the positive implementation of the convention, particularly by providing parties with the opportunity to learn whether they have sufficient resources or not, but they can learn from each other the best way to do it. Also, in terms of capacity building, sharing of skills and knowledge, sharing of critical investigative information, and field operations as well. In terms of what could be done to make international cooperation effective, I think, as I said, still it depends on the political willingness of the persons committee in charge with the power to make decisions. But CITES as a convention maybe could, provide for a way to ensure parties are committed more in terms of participating in such international cooperation arrangement. I note there is a now growing trend to have parties commit to environmental protection in trade-related agreements, and that could be one of the approaches that could be deployed to make, especially countries which are developing, to take positive action to enforce the convention by, attaching environmental concerns to international trade, therefore mingling the interests together so that parties are in a way forced to comply to environmental obligations. And that is my take on the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Director, if I may follow up very briefly, because it's very interesting that you mentioned trade, because indeed it seems that you have trade ongoing, so inspections have to take place anyway, imports at airports, etc. And one wonders whether there should not be a link between CITES and other activities under other treaties. And I came across, I'm not sure if you saw that as well, but there is at the moment there are a couple of pilot projects ongoing under the Basel Convention on Transboundary Shipments of Waste, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the Rotterdam Convention on International Trade in Hazardous Chemicals. So these are all environmental law treaties, conventions that deal with trade, and they all have secretariats that work together to do inspections together and enforcement actions together. And also the states are working together. And these projects are financed by Norway, Sweden, and Germany. And African countries like Tanzania are the countries that are involved. And I thought, wow, this is exactly what is needed also for CITES. So shouldn't you then maybe link this project also to CITES, or bring CITES under this initiative? If you haven't heard of it, then maybe it's something to look into. But maybe you can give your first ideas about this.
Thank you. I must admit this is the first time I'm hearing this, but I think it's a positive initiative, and I welcome it. I think more work can be done in this area as a further area for research, but I believe it has potential towards enforcing the conventions, not only in Tanzania, which is my country, but also in other developing countries. So I think it's a positive move, which I welcome. Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Coppens. Professor Coppens is Professor of International Economic Law at our university, and he's also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Dean. First of all, I want to join my colleagues in congratulating you, Frank, for this really rigorous work that you've done. It's a critical study that you've done. You've looked at a number of countries, which, as you've said, I think in your discussion, have a very diverse background. So I think it was quite a challenge indeed to summarize the challenges that each of those countries face in implementation, but also then to conduct a very interesting comparative analysis. I think you also present in your thesis some novel ideas for rethinking CITES, and thereby you would also, I think, inspire future research on this important topic. And then finally, I was also quite pleased to see that you implemented some of the recommendations that I made as part of my assessment. As you will understand, and the Dean explained my background in international economic law, I'm interested in the intersection between CITES and international trade law, and that's an aspect that you didn't discuss in much detail in your thesis. I think in your response that you gave on the previous question, you referred to trade-related measures. I'm interested also in that intersection between CITES and WTO law, but let me be more precise. In your chapter 8, you talk about lessons learned, and quite interestingly, in the introduction thereof, you set out the role of stricter domestic measures that members could adopt under Article 14 of CITES if they want to achieve a higher level of protection. And you set out the key relevance and the key importance of having such a right in light of the sovereign right of countries to indeed achieve a higher level of protection with regard to certain species. But at the same time, in your discussion, you also explained this, concerns that some countries, but also the Secretariat, have raised with regard to such stricter domestic measures. One of the concerns that you mentioned is that such measures might be inconsistent with parties' obligations under the World Trade Organization. So my question to you, Frank, is whether you agree with the concerns that are expressed by the parties and the Secretariat, and in particular where you agree that there is a risk of those stricter domestic measures being inconsistent with members' obligations under the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The esteemed opponent, I appreciate your comments and your feedback on the improved work. Thank you very much. My understanding of your question is to whether the strict domestic measure, which are allowed under CITES Article 14A1, are consistent with the principles of trade as stipulated by WTO and other international trade law instruments. At the first, I would like to say, historically, the convention is a product of compromise. This consent of strict domestic measures versus openness, transparency, and non-discrimination was a consent even at the beginning of the discussion towards enforcement of promulgation of the convention. So at the beginning, some parties were saying we should have strict measures. Some were saying we should allow each party to have its own law. And ultimately, the party came into compromise in a way where the convention reflects interests of both parties. It allows for setting up of international trade in a way, international trade of endangered species in a way that accommodate parties' interests, both countries who have higher concern for conservation of species, but others who have sufficient species to enable them enter into the trade. So the strict domestic measure is one of the recognition of such compromise, where parties can take actions that they think are important for preservation of what they consider important as to their environment. So I understand there are discussions which some scholars and parties have regarding taking strict measures as being inconsistent with the principles of non-discrimination, openness, transparency, and predictability as reflected in the WTO law. But personally, I do believe this has been in existence and it's a product of compromise, and therefore this do not necessarily affect the parties who have sufficient species, especially ones which are listed under Appendix 2, to trade them. As long as they do comply with the principles of non-discrimination, transparency, and predictability. So my take is, while other parties might have issues, but I think important is compliance with the principles. If the trade is conducted in a way which is fair, transparent, parties are informed of the measures which are strict, and they applied equally to all parties, I think it's still fair, because otherwise we couldn't have CITES. It's key to CITES to accommodate the compromising interests of the parties. Thank you.
Can I please ask a follow-up question? Do you believe that those principles, do they emerge from international trade law? Is that what you're saying? The principles that you just mentioned, if you tick all the boxes of those principles, do you comply with international trade law? Or is that an obligation that emerges from their CITES, from being CITES party?
And I think basically CITES is also, as the way it was crafted, it was crafted in a way that it appreciates also the principles of international trade laws. Therefore, CITES has, in a way, accommodated those principles, and trade of the species which are governed by CITES are required to comply with the principles of international trade law. And therefore, I think what has to be done is compliance in light of existing differences of parties. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I am very happy to welcome to this ceremony Professor Hamoudi Matiamba. Very good to have you here. Professor Matiamba is Professor of Environmental Law and Law and Governance at the University of Dar es Salaam. And he's also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would like to also allow him to raise a question for our candidates. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Apologies. I joined quite late. There was some communication hitch, but I've managed to address that. For the benefit of members, I must admit that
And Professor Matiamba, can you still hear me?
an area that you've covered, East Africa specifically, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, would it be possible for you to start over again because you were not audible?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry I was late because of communication hitches, but I'm glad we managed to resolve them. I went through, I examined the thesis, and I provided my comments, and I've read the feedback. All comments have been incorporated, and I'm grateful for that. So I'm saying for the benefit of members, I would like us to address a couple of two areas in terms of enforcement. The thesis rightly points out that one of the problems is funding, and priorities matter because of the state of the economies that we have in developing countries. However, in terms of Tanzania, there is a specific challenge with the routes that the traders use sometimes, the illicit traders, especially for Zanzibar. We have a different regime where we are two countries in one, and Zanzibar does not have a wildlife as in terms of where most trade is occurring, but it's been used as a transit route. And that's been a really big challenge. And for Tanzania specifically, I can see you've addressed it, but I say for the benefit of members, they should realize the extent to which that has been a problem. Secondly, I would like to join hands with Professor Jonathan, who observed rightly, I believe, that there is a challenge in terms of enforcement, and you're bringing up the same problem again, that it's been difficult to implement this, partly because of political will, but partly because of funding. And funding is more of a problem. Okay, I wish to stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm honored to have you. It was challenging, but we finally made it. I also agree with your comment regarding funding. We in Tanzania still have funding problem, though we are making progress compared to previous times. But also we have a challenge in Zanzibar, which does not, the way we are set up. So we have the unitary government, where we have Tanzania as a country, but which is made up of Tanzania mainland and Zanzibar. In terms of laws that enforce wildlife conservation treaties, each each jurisdiction has its laws. And the Zanzibar law is very, I would say, very lenient. It's not very strict. And therefore, the traders or illegal traders do take their products and species to Zanzibar and therefore take it out of the country using the weakness in the Zanzibar framework as well as the enforcement action. And therefore, I think I've tried to address it, but also I see it's more of political related issue which has to be addressed as we go along. I think it's also a potential area for further research. Thank you.
Professor Majamba, are you satisfied with the response by the candidate?
Yes, that is the area that I wanted to share with the rest of the colleagues in terms of that peculiarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Prévost, who teaches international economic law at our university. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I would like to join my colleagues in congratulating you on your interesting and well-written dissertation, exploring the important topic of implementation of CITES obligations. And my question relates to something you've emphasized both in your presentation today and in your thesis, namely that the enforcement of CITES largely depends on the willingness of members to enforce its terms through their domestic enactments. I was happy to see that in your answer to the question of Professor Verschoorn, you mentioned the topic of free trade agreements that incorporate obligations to effectively implement various multilateral environmental agreements, including CITES. So I would like to ask you to dive a bit deeper into this topic and to give us your opinion on whether the incorporation of such an obligation for the effective implementation of CITES in the trade and sustainable development chapters in the European Union's free trade agreements and in similar environmental chapters in the United States free trade agreements have some potential to incentivize, by using market power, the effective implementation of CITES by its parties. In particular, I'd like to ask whether you think that the new approach of the European Union to couple this obligation with effective dispute settlement system and the possibility of trade sanctions is the right way forward, or perhaps was the previous approach of having a softer, more cooperative mechanism for compliance better in view of the capacity constraints that often hinder the effective implementation of CITES obligations? I look forward to your answer.
Thank you very much, dear esteemed opponent. As I did mention, CITES is, well, it's an environmental law instrument. It's also linked to international trade. And international trade takes place between parties, and parties are now forming trade agreements to promote their trade relationship. Free trade agreements, the FTAs, are now coming up as one of the measures to enforce various trade-related obligations among parties. They provide incentives, but they provide sanctions for compliance issues. I had to admit that I did not look into FTAs as I was researching into this topic. But now that I think it has come out, and I would like to respond to this based on my understanding of the subject, and maybe this could be a very good future area for further research in relation to CITES. So as I said, parties are compliant to international obligations while they are required to comply with international obligations as they conduct trade of endangered species. Basically, they are required to comply with international trade laws. FTAs provide parties with incentive for more markets, more opportunities, more alliance, and stuff like that. Understand, for example, the European Union has now close to 41, I think, FTAs. And a few contain this sustainable trade and sustainable development clause, which seeks to enforce international environmental obligations as part of the trade deals among parties. I think, in my opinion, deployment of the strict measures depends on the circumstance of the contracting parties. If you have a poor country contracting with a bit empowered economically country, it is unlikely that the FTA will succeed to attain its objective. But where you deploy the soft approach, again, it's unlikely that the parties will enforce. So I think the former has potential towards attainment of the intended objective of incorporating environmental obligation in FTAs, but it has to be done in a way that appreciates the difference in the environment of the parties. Otherwise, it's unlikely to succeed. That is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm happy to allow Professor Peters to raise a second question.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity indeed to submit the second question. Dear candidates, I now move to the implementation question again, and how to improve indeed implementation. Your thesis refers here and there to bureaucratic processes, and you argue to shorten the procedures. I think, however, that before recommending shortening of procedures, a deeper discussion should take place of how quick and efficient procedures could be to the benefit of the protection of species. Also in view of the potential complexity of making the right assessments, taking the right decisions. So if decisions are complex, are then sufficiently lengthy procedures needed to ensure that the right decisions will be taken? In relation to that, in the EU chapter, you mention a comment of traders who say that there are often very long permit application processes that have negatively impacted their business operations. I would like to invite you to provide some further thoughts on the issue of whether and how to shorten procedures. In the European Union, we have the Aarhus Convention as well, which introduces public participation. So indeed, you take the position to shorten procedures, but my question is, are the decisions simple enough to speed up procedures? And would there be any need, it's an open question, for public participation in such authorization procedures? I look forward to your answers.
Thank you very much. I think the question of bureaucratic process emerges everywhere in implementation of the convention. Throughout, even in the US, which is the developed country, there are still bureaucratic process to do with consultations. Tanzania, the same. India, and everywhere. I think this is a major concern. And partly is because the governments are keen to take note of the risk of not appreciating a technical issue that might have impact on the implementation of the laws. In particular, if you make it very simple, chances are certain important aspect may be skipped. But again, there's so much impact when the processes are very wrong and bureaucratic. One, they deny the traders of the potential markets. And importantly, they affect the species themselves, because the species which are traded, especially live animals, have to be preserved in a way that ensures their well-being. So if you make the procedures very lengthy, you might in a way affect their well-being. So I think it's a compromise. A compromise approach has to be deployed where the procedures are not too long that they become bureaucratic, but not very quick that they do not appreciate certain important aspects. And in regard to involvement of the public, I think it's possible to involve the public in issuance of permits, specifically when the permits now issued by using technology. Application can be done over the internet, all the documentations can be posted, and if the system linked together, you could have licenses being processed on time, and permits being issued online, and trade is facilitated in that way. So I think that can be done. I understand in other countries that may be challenged because of funding and technological development, internet connectivity and such. But I think as we go along, the world is evolving and technology is developing. I think in the future that could be done. And I was surprised, I come from Tanzania, and I was surprised to note that this is also still a challenge in the US, in the European Union, where I think internet is a bit more available and speedier. And I was also surprised why such information is not posted. I think just by posting the information in the official website, you could make the information available online, and the public can be invited to comment in the shortest possible time. I think that requires just commitment to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I am also very happy to allow Professor Verschuren to raise a second question.
Yes, thank you. In light of the time, I will be very brief, dear candidates. Well, you are quite positive, I think, about the EU because they implemented much more detailed and stricter regulations in order to harmonize and enhance the implementation, monitoring, and enforcement of CITES across the EU. And these regulations have added teeth to the convention. But your recommendations are more practical, I would say, practical improvements, not so much changing CITES as such. Wouldn't it be wise to argue that a protocol should be adopted to CITES at the international level, which is very similar to the type of detailed rules that we have in the EU? Would that be helpful to increase implementation?
Thank you very much. Again, this takes me to the history of the convention itself. It's a compromise among parties, close to now 83 parties, including the EU, which is an organization party. I think it would have been very good to have a protocol which provide for more details regarding the practical implementation aspects, but coming to a compromise on this aspect, I think, would require sometimes. I think I was thinking that could be achieved through the secondary rules, the conference of party resolutions and decision of the conference of parties. And after these parties, after these issues are now part of the parties, are part of the international law, then they could be, written as a protocol to CITES. But as it stands, and given the divergent nature of the CITES parties, moving towards a protocol is likely to be attainable, because I think there will be a lot of reservation because the parties vary in terms of their the enforcement actions and the availability of resources. So I think
But
that could be done, but that requires time.
Is it your role as a researcher to already envision potential problems that countries might have?
No, not potentially, but I was explaining this from the background of the convention itself. Thank you.
And what does that, if I may, dear candidate, what does that mean? Could you still elaborate a bit more on that?
What? Sorry.
Could you still elaborate a bit more on what that exactly means, what you just said?
Oh, so I was explaining this from the historical part of the convention, that the convention came out after a long time discussion, and it represents compromise among parties because the parties could not agree.
E.C.Sina, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company online await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you.
FAUNA. The degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van den Bossche is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
FAUNA.
Yes, thank
Do
you.
you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent and independent, and responsible?
Yes, I do.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Frank E.C.Sina, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisors, affixed with the official seal of the university, as now shown by the beadle.
Thank you.
Frank, it is my pleasure to pronounce the laudatio. And it is my pleasure to be the very first to address you with your new academic title, Dr. Sina. Today, we mark the happy end of a journey which started almost 10 years ago. On this journey, the challenges and the obstacles were manifold and considerable. But your determination to bring this PhD research to a conclusion never wavered. And I admire you for this. Thinking about what I would say in this laudatio, I realized that we actually only met once in person. Once. And this was in Arusha when I was there to teach a course at Trapka. But over the years, we of course exchanged, there must have been hundreds of emails, and we had Skype, and more recently, Zoom meetings. And you and I will remember that some of these meetings were a bit of a technical challenge. Your PhD research really started making major progress when Professor Trouwborst agreed to become your co-supervisor. Because unlike me, Arie Trouwborst is a true expert on the topic of your research, and his guidance has made all the difference. In this laudatio, I would like to mention the following, because I think this is important to put your achievement in context. While you were working on your PhD thesis, you actually made an impressive career as a government official of Tanzania, when we first were in contact, you were a mere legal officer. And you were later promoted to senior state attorney, and now serve your country as principal state attorney. I also understand that you were recently assigned to establish, and then once established, run a national audit academy, which is to become the training and research and innovation center for the Supreme Audit Office of Tanzania and neighboring countries. Since 2019, and I must admit you have kept that hidden for me, but since 2019, you have published in peer-reviewed law journals a number of articles on public sector auditing and the fight against corruption. And of course, this is all possible when you have an online defense. You were not speaking to us, you were not defending your thesis from Tanzania, but you currently find yourself in Vienna, where you are part of the Tanzanian delegation in a UN working session on the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Frank, Maastricht University is proud to count you among its doctors in law, and so am I. Also, on behalf of Professor Trouwborst, I wish you the very, very best in your future career. Thank you.
Can I perhaps add just a few words as well at this moment? Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear Dr. Sina, it is my great pleasure to be present at this moment as Professor van der Bossen said, the end of a long and rich journey. Perhaps not always easy, but a PhD trajectory is never supposed to be easy. And you made it. I really enjoyed our conversations over email or on screen on the content of CITES and the way it is being implemented nationally in various jurisdictions. I remember fondly, I have to say, one long read of a long manuscript of you in the shadow of trees in my Spanish holiday vacation, very pleasantly going through your various chapters, trying to give suggestions on how to tweak things and reach even sharper levels of analysis. And I've learned a lot from you on the way that this important convention works in all these jurisdictions. And you never lost sight of the helicopter view. We've also just stressed that in our deliberations. So yeah, an incredible achievement. My warm congratulations. And I do hope we will have a chance to meet in person someday. And I hope that you will have nice occasions with colleagues and with loved ones to celebrate this major achievement in your life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Sina, also on behalf of Maastricht University and its Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. I always say it's a very special degree because it's the highest one we have available at this university. And I also extend my congratulations to your close family and friends, and of course also to your supervisors. I also want to take the opportunity to thank all the members of the committee, particularly also those coming from outside of our own university, for attending this ceremony. Thank you so much. Please do celebrate. And with this, I close this academic ceremony of Maastricht University.
Thank you.